about the story behind so many of the pigments that we keep squirting out and wasting, you know? Because they have got a story, and so I'm going to make an attempt to tell it. And I want to take you back 40,000 years. 40,000. 40,000.
Oh, thank you.
Because that is the date of the cave drawings in the south of France and north of Spain.
You're running out of chairs, you've got too many ones.
I think it's just extraordinary to think 40,000 years ago, human beings could draw and paint, and they did it from memory. Nobody got bisons into a cave and draw the jolly bison. It was from their experience out hunting and so on that they remembered these images. That is an incredible human achievement. And you know what? They were using the same pigments that we use today. Now, burnt sienna, charcoal, clay, different coloured clays. And at the time they were doing these extraordinary works, the Aborigine people were just starting to walk across the coast of Australia. So we've been drawing and painting from a heck of a long time, you know. And a lot of the pigments, the clay pigments, we still use. Charcoal, we still use. Our blacks are all charcoal, you know. And yet 40,000 years ago. And so the history of Western, I'm talking Western painting here, the history of Western painting really goes back. One of the questions I had in the back of my mind is how the hell did they get to the south of France? Out of Africa. It's a long walk. Unless the Straits of Gibraltar were closed. And they were. The Mediterranean Sea was a lake, it was a freshwater lake. So they came across the North Africa, up through Spain, and on up into the mountains. Okay, so that gives us a sort of perspective about how long we've been using clay paints. Most of those, you know, they're just clay out of the ground. And it's wonderfully permanent because it's been there for umpteen million years. So it's, you know, it's got a fade and started by now. You know. So let's look there at some of the pigments that we've got in our boxes that have got some story behind them. And the first one is ultramarine. Ultramarine. The most expensive pigment in the history of Western art. Ultramarine. As you all probably know, it's a semi-precious stone, lapis lazuli, and the Italian Renaissance painters hadn't a clue where it came from, except that it came ultramarine, beyond the sea. I used to think, you know, ultramarine, oh, that means it's a sea colour, you know, a sea blue colour. No, ultra, beyond. Ultramarine, beyond the sea, and of course it came out of Afghanistan. And the Taliban are still selling it to the West as lapis lazuli so they could buy some guns to shoot people. So it's still, you know, got a life. Now, when last year, and I talked about the development of the Renaissance and tried to make the point that the Renaissance was only possible because of trade. People were rich and they wanted to show off their wealth, and they couldn't buy big flash yachts like they do today because they didn't have them. So they gave money to paint pictures in the church, or create art. So they paid artists to show off. The other way they made them showed off their wealth was to collect books and create libraries in private homes. That was wonderful. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is that once these guys were rich selling clothing, basically, textiles, and that's where the Medici family got all the money from, selling textiles. You right? You haven't missed much. The textile merchants were the ones that had the greatest wealth, and they were the ones who started to sponsor paintings in churches, because they felt, well, I better have a word in somewhere, so I'll spend my day on painting churches. And the tradition quite quickly developed that ultramarine, the most expensive pigment they had, would be the virgin's dress. It would be restricted to that. This wasn't a rule, it just became a tradition. And so the only ultramarine blue in a painting would be the virgin. Okay? So that set this whole thing up with decoration coming into church, and later the church started to sponsor artists to do the decorations. But that's where Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, all these guys got their dough. And that's fine. But hey, ultramarine, very valuable, very expensive. We better make damn sure that the artist uses the real thing, because there are cheaper versions, poorer versions, and copper sulphate looks a bit bluey and could be used to adulterate the colour. How do we keep an eye on these guys? And that brought me to thinking, all right, Michelangelo and Raphael and those guys, where did they get their colours from? Did they go out and dig some raw umber out of the ground? Did they go and fire some clay from sienna and get burnt sienna? Well, they might have done, but they wouldn't be able to keep up with all of their needs, as pigments and oils and all that other stuff. So who provided it? The answer is the apothecary. The apothecaries they dealt in rare stuff, but mainly material things like pigments. And so they were the ones that you bought the stuff off. You went and saw it. Imagine going down to Kensington Farms and you come to get some ultramarine blue. But that was the way it worked. Now this is interesting, because the apothecary kept very accurate records, because they were answerable to the tradesmen who were sponsoring the art. So they kept very good records, and it wasn't long, it was during the Renaissance, that the apothecaries actually controlled the art world. It's quite interesting, because if you've got a commission to paint, a thing you've got, and particularly if we're going to use ultramarine, then you went along to the apothecary and you signed up, and they made a careful record. Here he is, g'day. Can we find him? Look after your boss.
Oh, he's great. Excuse me, Paul.
I'm just talking about, I think I told you, talking about the story behind some of the pigments. And I'm talking about ultramarine to start with, because it was the most expensive pigment in the world of art, Western art, and it was controlled, supplied by the apothecary. That's the point I'm making. And the apothecary, of course, also controlled poison. Romeo and Juliet, oh, true apothecary, thy drugs are. Right there, a plug for the chemist. Oh, true apothecary, thy drugs are quick. Yeah, so the apothecaries kept records, and then they started to enrol artists. And so if you wanted to be an artist, you could always go and work for an artist grinding pigments, but that didn't teach you art. But if you wanted to sign up and learn art, the apothecary kept the records. And so we can now go to the apothecary's records and find out when Rembrandt actually signed up to be a journeyman, as it were, or to start his career in art. That goes back a long way. It still goes right back to the Renaissance, with the apothecary keeping the records. And so, that's the way ultramarine was controlled. And when you had been training for long enough, you took a painting to the apothecary. He said, have you brought your masterpiece? And you say, yes. He looks at it and says, you're a master or you're not. But it's quite interesting to realise that the art world was controlled outside of the art world by the apothecaries, and this continued right up to fairly recent times. So there we are, Kensington Pharmacy's got a lot to answer for. Now that was the story behind ultramarine. It came out of Afghanistan. They're still quarrying it. Lapis lazuli is its name as a semi-precious stone, and you aren't buying it anymore because it's too dear for you. And what happened was this stuff was just so expensive. And there was a chemist, a French chemist, who was experimenting with coloured glazes. Now this is important because everyone's trying to imitate Chinese porcelain and finding out where they get the colour from, And this guy got his mixture of glazes and fired it really, really high. He really pushed the temperature up and he got a colour so close to ultramarine that he called it French ultramarine. And that's what you are using today. Although they've dropped the word French because nobody's going to kid you that it really is lapis lazuli. It's a glaze. And so that's how we got it not on the cheap, but that's how we got around the expense of this pigment. The next one's cobalt blue, and that also came out of Afghanistan. Now, I don't know that it's chemically related to ultramarine, but you can see from the example, it's not as strong, it's got less red in it. Bearing in mind, that's pure blue. That's the blue that colour printers use as their pure blue. So you can see that is quite a different colour, and you see the fact that it's got some red in its spectrum, even more red than ultramarine. So this is our Northland sky, high sky, down to Cerulean. This is more the North American sky with so much sulfur dioxide and other pollutants in it that it shifts it into a reddish. But cobalt blue's got a touch, because we had the silk trail coming out of China and getting right to the Mediterranean. We talked about that last year. And the Chinese merchants, because at Samarkand, saw these extraordinary Arab decorations for the mosques, which were white, with this wonderful blue lettering, the calligraphy, because they weren't allowed to do what Christians were doing and paint pictures of Jesus. That's not on. But you were allowed to use calligraphy and say good things about Allah and so on. And so these Chinese saw this stuff and they took it back. This is cobalt blue. Took the cobalt blue back into China and see how they could use it in glazes. And what do you know? We got the blue Ming vase, because this was the Ming dynasty, the last great dynasty of China, and so with our cobalt blue. And this one is the one that you are using if you are using artist quality pigments. If you're using student quality, then you've got a very close resemblance to cobalt blue made by the French guy that made the, he just didn't cook it quite so much and he got a cobalt blue, cook it a bit more and he got an ultramarine. And so that's the story behind those two